Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at the conclusion of a fascinating panel discussion on the future of the defense industrial base. And joining us is one of those panelists, Frank Kendall, former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, the only person who started with that job in decades and ended his stint at the Pentagon doing that. You're now on boards. You're doing some writing and some thinking and getting to spend some more time with your family. Frank, thanks very much for taking some time with us.
Thanks, Vago. Great to be with you.
It's always a pleasure. The first I want to ask you, Eric, we just interviewed Eric Tuning, who's the industrial base chief of the Pentagon. He said, look, we're in a shutdown. I asked whether he's using any extraordinary tools, and he said, look, the Defense Department, following what Secretary Mattis has said, is going to be there and is going to be delivering. That was the same sentiment that was expressed by Leon Panetta when he was Defense Secretary. Ash Carter was his deputy. You were the acquisition secretary then. But talk to us about what some of the impacts are in a real-world sense, even if it's a very short shutdown. Because you mentioned there are a couple of examples about how you can actually end up with relatively large impacts in seemingly small ways.
Now, the damage accumulates pretty quickly. Initially, people will find workarounds. They'll find ways to keep going, but that's a matter of days, a few days. And they'll carry some of the costs associated with shutdown, as long as it's not too long. As time goes on, people have to furlough their workers without pay. They can't absorb the cost of their workers. If your federal supervisor is not available to supervise you, then you can't go to work. One of the major impacts is on production lines. Work that's completed can be put out in the parking lot and parked until somebody can come inspect it and accept it. But work in progress is another matter. Defense Contract Management Agency in particular does a lot of quality assurance, quality control work of factories that are in the process of doing assembly. And it does that at various levels of the supply chain. If those inspectors aren't there, then that work stops. And very quickly, that causes a backup and plants have to close, and that has a major impact on those workers. Industry will try to recover whatever costs are associated with that from the government through claims. And so they'll pass that cost, if they can, onto the taxpayer. But it's very disruptive, and it gets worse over time very quickly.
The start of the panel discussion, CSIS, Andrew Hunter and his team, along with AIA, rolled out a study on the impact on the defense industry of the Budget Control Act. You were in office and had to live with that awful piece of legislation the entire time that you were in office. What do you think about their findings, their conclusions, and what are some impacts that you saw while you were in the job on the defense industrial base of this sort of budgetary uncertainty?
The instability and the uncertainty we dealt with causes all sorts of problems. Makes it very difficult to do planning. We went through periods where we did budgets to sequestration levels and then did adjustments to that as kind of an option. We did plans where we just simply went to what the president would ask for, which I think was the right thing at the end of the day. The president should ask for what he thinks he needs to defend the nation, not be bound by sequestration. And in each year, we achieved a compromise of some kind, with the exception of 2013, when sequestration was actually implemented. And a very devastating impact, by the way, because that was several months into the year. We had not prepared for it. We didn't expect it to happen. It was a surprise. We dealt with that, but it was an impact that was spread across the entire department, particularly to industry. So in this case, here we are with a shutdown. Damage will accumulate over time. But in general, the instability of a CR process is debilitating. The department has gotten used to the idea of a 3-month or so CR in the fall. And budget planning now is kind of built around that presumption, which is unfortunate because in a normal order, we would have budgets before the fiscal year began. When it extends beyond that very much, as it has now, it becomes much, much more disruptive. New starts, production rate increases, multi-year contracts, a lot of things are impacted by that. The inability to let contracts compresses work for the remainder of the year and makes people have to rush at the end of the year to get contracts out before funds have to be deobligated or expire. And so there's a sea of things that just accelerate and get worse as things get further into the year.
How concerned are you about smaller tier contractors? You made a point that said You said, look, Boeing can absorb a $2 billion, even though I'm not necessarily sure Leanne Carrette would completely agree with you on that. But it is a gigantic company. It's the world's largest aerospace concern. So there is reserve there to deal with the program issue, although looking at it from the customer's standpoint, that was part of the deal, because it was deemed as a relatively low-risk contract. But what are the impacts, particularly on smaller companies, and is there a concern that they will move out of business? You said, I'm not worried about the big guys leaving the defense business, but you are very worried about the small guys.
Yeah, the people who do forgings came up, I think, today. They do parts, they do components. Defense may be their only business, or they may be a commercial firm that also does commercial work. And what happens in those firms in times like this is those leaders of those firms make judgments about whether to stay in the defense business or not. If they don't have any choice, they may not have any choice about staying in business. Big firms have access to capital that small firms do not, inexpensive capital. And it's a big problem. And it gets worse as you get further down into this supply chain. I don't think people recognize the thousands of companies that build components and subassemblies that go into our major programs. To a large extent, the primes have divested of in-house work of that type, and they've gone out to suppliers for it, and then they do the final assembly. And so it's a very big concern. Industry, that market is so large and so diverse and so diffuse that what needs to happen is for people that are caught by this and under financial pressure because of it need to just raise their arms and go to both the primes, the people they supply to, as well as to the government to see if there's anything that can be done to provide some relief. In some cases there is, but in many cases there's not.
The administration is working on its defense industrial strategy. It's seen to be a holistic one, but the foundational principles are President Trump's, America first, buy America, build America. And at no time in history have we been more dependent on a global industrial base than we are today to satisfy our defense needs. And all of our adversaries have access to the same technology. Your whole career has been characterized with tracking these trends, and you've been ringing alarm bells on this for a very, very long time, particularly about the rise of China and some of China's capabilities. But talk to us, is there a way the administration, in your view, can square this circle? Eric indicated that they would acknowledge the importance of the global industrial base on the United States, but also try to advance these domestic interests. What are the best ways to advance the domestic interest? Granted that we're no longer sort of the arsenal of democracy that's doing everything within our shores anymore, and reconciling that with a global industrial base on which we depend.
Yeah, one of the strategic strengths of the United States is our system of alliances and friends around the world. And many of those countries that we work with very closely are very capable, very well modernized. We have a very strong positive balance to payments in aerospace and defense. It's one of the few areas in which we do. And we have a strength through being able to take advantage of our friends. And we don't want to discourage them from the U.S. market. They contribute to programs like the F-35, which has a very widespread international supply base. That's a very positive thing for us. It contributes to lower cost, it contributes to better products. And it's in an area in which we already have a substantial advantage in terms of balance of trade. So I would not want to see that fundamentally disrupted in some kind of a Buy America approach to this. It would be a mistake strategically, be a mistake for our businesses and economically. So we'll see how the study comes out. The study is set up by the executive order to be very broad and very deep. It addresses a lot of things. I think they've had to scale back their initial ambitions and what they're going to do. I think they've asked for a little more time. So we'll see what the product says at the end of the day. But I hope it acknowledges the important contributions our international partners make because it's substantial.
Let me ask you about the broader job. The Obama administration tried to set up manufacturing hubs, design centers. There was a whole effort to look at the national industrial base as something, not just look at it from a defense industrial standpoint, but look at it as a national industrial base. But there are a myriad of challenges associated with doing that. There is individual corporate interest. Talk to us about what some templates could be as somebody who's studied this from at least the defense piece of it, but also tracked technology development worldwide. What are some of the right ways the United States can do this to try to maintain overall technological primacy against a very directed economy that is making some very focused investments on what the big future is going to be? And we are being surprised, for example, how good Chinese AI and autonomy, they're a lot more advanced than we expected, which is easy to do when you're in an authoritarian system that says you're going to invest money and here's a national priority, AI, for example.
The department needs to take advantage of commercial technologies like artificial intelligence, autonomy that are being developed very quickly. Information technology in general is on a trajectory that's driven by commercial investments. And there are a few others, some of the biological technologies. The department needs to find ways to bring those technologies rapidly into our products. Now, those commercial entities are not going to build weapon systems for us. That's not the business they're in. It's not a business they want to be in. It's not a business they're very capable of doing anything in. But our primes, in particular, who do and will continue to supply those sorts of systems, need to have access to those technologies, and they need business arrangements which allow those technologies to come in and be absorbed pretty quickly and then updated fairly quickly. Modular open systems and open architectures are two of the tools we have to do that. Those have been policy for a very long time. They were policy before the previous administration and emphasized in the Obama administration. I think that needs to continue, and it needs to be enforced to make sure that the primes actually do build systems that can accommodate very frequent upgrades in those technologies.
And let me ask you one last question. One of the points that you made was that the biggest impediment actually to innovation are the military services from the standpoint of the operators not willing and wanting to take risk. So talk to us, you've talked about this problem before. Talk to us about the problem. Talk to us about ways to solve it. And what's the advice that you're giving Jim Mattis, for example, who is beginning to tackle all of the things that folks have been talking about for a long time, right? How much education is enough education? Let's not overdo jointness to the point where it becomes, a liability, not an advantage. And he's somebody who's looking at trying to drive, he was somebody who had a reputation for being innovative operationally. Talk to us about that problem, that challenge in some ways to surmount it.
Yeah, I see a need for fundamental rethinking of how we fight and how we equip forces to fight. The basic operating concept of U.S. forces today has its roots in World War II. And it's centered around platforms like fighter planes, fighter bombers, aircraft carriers, and armored vehicles that are direct line of sight vehicles, basically with their lethality. And we've augmented and expanded and enhanced and improved the ability of those basic systems to function for decades. Some of it was called an offset strategy of the 70s and 90s. Was about precision munitions, stealth, and networking being applied onto that still fundamental same set of equipment. I think we need to rethink that. I think autonomy and artificial intelligence are opening up possibilities as well as developments on the other side in terms of lethality. Now, one area in which the department has actually made some progress on this is in space. In space, as in other domains, we tend to rely on a small number of very high-value assets. Those are targetable. And we now have a situation where we have adversaries, particularly China, who've thought very carefully about the U.S.'s potential vulnerabilities and is well down the road of building systems designed to defeat those systems. Whether it's an air base that's forward because of the range of our fighter bombers, or it's a carrier that has to go fairly far forward, or whether it's a satellite that'll go overhead just a few hundred miles away, those assets can be attacked, and they can be overwhelmed in many cases. We have to come to grips with that. And I think that requires a fundamental rethinking of how we do operations and how we equip our forces, and maybe how we organize our forces. At the end of the day, that's not a technologist responsibility or an acquisition person's responsibility. It's an operational responsibility. And I think that while I do see some progress and some recognition of the importance of these threats, I still think we have a long way to go in addressing them.
And that was something you did right after the Gulf War. You were the guy who did the assessment inside on, what were the lessons learned, and that was a report that was, I think, pretty fascinating for the Chinese.
It absolutely was. Nobody studied our method of warfare after the Gulf War more closely than Chinese. They regarded it as revolutionary. It was revolutionary. We went into that war thinking we would have 10 or 20,000 casualties. We had a couple hundred. And the reason we had such low casualties was the combination of precision munitions, networking, stealth, and wide area surveillance systems. Those things working together, implemented through the kinds of systems I talked about a moment ago, ground vehicles, fighter bombers, and aircraft coming from aircraft carriers or fixed bases, which support from satellites, are the things that we did to demonstrate that kind of superiority. And we've basically kept that concept, fielded more of the same kinds of capabilities over the last quarter century. In that same quarter century, China in particular has figured out how they think they can defeat that set of capabilities.
And one last question, because I know you've got to go. Talk to us about how the new acquisition organization is gelling from your standpoint. What's working? What's not working? What is some hard-fought, experienced advice you would throw in from the sidelines?
Well, it appears, first of all, it's a work in progress. And I think it's an experiment in a way that will probably be adjustments later on as people get more experience with it. The most disappointing thing to me is how long it's taking. Before I left the department, I knew Bob Work was going to be sticking around for a few months. I said that you should decide what this new organization looks like right away, get it in place, and then if the Congress doesn't like it, they can comment on it and tell us what to do, but people won't be in limbo about what their job is and who they work for. That's very debilitating and dysfunctional. So unfortunately, the process of sorting out the organization continues. And now you have a situation where, or we're soon to have a situation where we have 3 undersecretaries, the DCMO, Chief Management Officer, Undersecretary for Management, I guess, Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, and Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment will be in place and trying to wrestle about what organizational elements report to who and what their jobs really are. The statute was reasonably clear on this, and if you just followed the statute, you could have got the organization sorted out pretty quickly. I would have taken whatever liberty there is in the statute to preserve a single chain of command, single person in the chain of command for acquisition. I think that's the right answer. But it's not the only answer. What may happen as a result of this reorganization is that the deputy secretary becomes much more important in the hierarchy, because the other undersecretaries have a difference of opinion, then automatically would have to go to the deputy secretary for resolution. So I think there may be much more of that. Cooperation among the different undersecretaries is critical, and people always matter more than organizations. So how the people in those positions work together, reinforce and support each other is going to be critical to the success of the reorganization.
Let me ask you one more question, because this is something that my friend and colleague Tony Capaccio from Bloomberg and I both are interested in. Should there be a change? You know, the Pentagon has always used weighted guidelines as a method to drive where industry should go in the wake of a giant tax cut that is going to, you know, benefit U.S. defense industrial players. You know, the offshore elements of it not as important, but certainly the lower tax rate. All the companies are very happy about. Boeing magnanimously, you know, has talked about, you know, the extra investment and how that's going to be reflected back $300 million, I think, in their workforce. Does the department have to take certain steps? Because when you were the undersecretary, you know, this is a question that Wall Street guys asked you a lot, lawmakers asked you a lot, critics asked you a lot. You know, despite a Budget Control Act, the companies were doing better than ever. They were throwing off bigger dividends. They were doing share buybacks. They weren't investing as much as you guys wanted to see them invest. So does the department have to do things a little bit differently, given that the companies are going to have this windfall, to ensure that the investment is going to go into open systems, new technologies, new systems that you want, as opposed to closed architectures? Because, you know, you ended up becoming very controversial for actually trying to drive the defense industrial base to actually be more open and scratch some of those itches. What's your sense on that?
Well, first of all, the effective tax rate on corporations in the United States, because of all the deductions that are available and so on, has been traditionally in the order of 19 or 20%. So this isn't, at the end of the day, a fundamental change in that regard. Although what happens to those deductions and write-offs and so on now is, I think, somewhat of an open question in terms of how IRS actually implements this. I think right now there are more questions than answers within industry about how the government's going to behave here. And one of those questions is, will the weighted guidelines be changed so that the allowed margins will be reduced to effectively claw back, if you will, the tax reduction? That's still unknown. And I think that's a good question for the administration to answer at some point. In industry, I think CEOs in general and boards are trying to decide the best way to use the additional funds. The companies I'm familiar with, there are additional funds coming because of this. And they're looking at a range of things, including additional investment, including capital exercises, but also including additional dividends and stock buyback. Rates, the idea of the whole task cut, I think in part, was that it would trickle down to increased wages for people, that salaries would go up as a result of this. I don't know if that will happen. Companies have to stay competitive, and a big part of the competition is rates. So whether companies are going to raise their rates, they'll probably look and see what their competitors do. and then make a decision based on that. But I don't think that's going to be the immediate response. I think it's going to go in other directions.
Frank, always a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Yep. Great. Good to be with you, Vago. Thank you.